here we are in the second lecture of chapter 16 to 17, looking at crude oil, petroleum products, and renewable energy sources. Okay, what we have here is a refinery stack. So we take our crude oil and we pump it into this furnace, and it heats the whole substance up. Now remember, crude oil is a mixture of a lot of different hydrocarbon substances. So as it goes into this furnace, the ones that have the longer carbon chains, remember we're looking at these as being hydrocarbons. So the more carbons I have, I'll just put a couple here. And we'll do one more. Of course, I'm doing it backwards. The ones with the short carbon chains, these guys are going to float up here at the top, and they're going to be collected, probably condensed somewhere up here at the top. And the ones with longer carbon chains, let's imagine this is like 50 or so, that's going to be gathered somewhere here at the bottom. And the reason this is the case is because these have more surface area, and there's more intermolecular forces between these different hydrocarbons. So they're going to be more sticky together. The ones that are a little shorter, have shorter carbon chains, the only things really holding these things together is something called London dispersion forces, and that's not much. So these guys are gathering up at the top because they're not really sticky or connected to each other. Okay, and just take a look at some of the different names here, the type of substances you would find in these different locations. OPEC, this is an organization mostly in the Middle East region. The one that sticks out that I know is not over there is Venezuela. They're obviously South America, but they control a vast majority of the amount of oil in the world. And they get together and kind of decide what kind of output they want to have to control supply and demand a little bit. The ones that's listed here, we'll take note of this. It says Saudi Arabia has the largest supply of oil within OPEC. That depends which resource you're looking at. Our book mentions this, and we're kind of going to go with that. But in 2011, Venezuela kind of popped up and says, well, we have more oil than Saudi Arabia. So the most recent literature, 2011, says that Venezuela has more oil. And it's a little bit suspect, but we're going to kind of lean on Saudi Arabia. Historically has had more oil. Okay. Something about peak. That's going to come up in the next slide here, just kind of showing that once we hit a peak amount of oil, then from there on out, we're on the downside of the slope, and we're going to start losing production. So demand's going to go up, costs should go up. So here we can take a look at the price of oil. We're using $2,006 as a comparison. We can see back 1981 or so, Reagan takes office. Oil is very, very expensive, and then it comes way down. Good times. And then you guys probably remember sometime, it's actually kept going up somewhere about 2008. I think it peaked somewhere in there. It got pretty pricey, but of course now it's come down quite a bit. But actually, I believe oil sits somewhere between $80 and $90 a barrel, sitting here in 2014. Okay. So, efficiency. This is very interesting. Since about 1985 or so, across the board, fuel efficiency hasn't increased in about 30 years. All these different things we do to cars, the efficiency hasn't gone up much. So, in this time period, we've had cars that have gotten really, really large. Think Navigators or Hummers, whatever. That, of course, would be not really light trucks, but we've had vehicles like that. And we've had real small cars, but on average, we're kind of flats. Yeah, we're just starting to kind of angle up here a little bit. So we'll see where this trend goes in the next coming years. But to be perfectly honest, sitting here at this point, about 2010, this kind of mileage, less than 25 miles per gallon for cars, not so good. We could probably do a lot better. But there are some definite limitations, which we'll talk about here in the next coming slides. So, supplies. This is interesting. We, United States, we only got about 3% of the world's crude oil, and that's a little bit debatable. And we'll talk more about that later on as far as different types. But this is just talking about drilling a hole in the ground, pumping oil out of the ground. We have 3%. Look at about 1974, that's when we peaked out, about halfway through all of our cheap oil, we'll call it. Also interesting, a large amount of that oil comes in through the Gulf of Mexico, Houston area. All right, this is what I was trying to get to earlier, the Herbert Curve. Looking at this guy, he's a geophysicist, 1950s or so, he predicts about 1970 that we're going to hit peak oil in the United States. That's the point where we're going to have as much oil that we're going to be able to produce in any given year, and from there on out, we're going to produce less and less and less every year after. And you can kind of draw the curve in the year wherever you like. What do you want to call it, 1970, 1975? It really doesn't matter. It just shows that we're getting to a point where we've hit the most production out of a well or wells that we have. And from there on out, you're going to have less production every single year. And ultimately, you're coming to a point where it's no longer economically feasible to pull this stuff out of the ground. So, interesting. Based on that prediction, we're looking, somewhere in the ballpark of 40 years, and sometimes we see a curve of, say, 75 years before we run out of oil. We have to start looking at something else. The reason that's kind of a up in the air number is there's a lot of different types of oil that are out there, and we can utilize them, but the cost is a little bit different. In comparison, we are very blessed with a lot of coal. The United States has a great amount of coal. Some would say the most in the world. Either us or China has the most amount of coal in the world. So we have quite a bit of coal. And the reason it's so much more, you could say, is the source of that coal. The coal primarily comes from vegetation that was buried without oxygen. And of course, if you look around, there's lots of vegetation hanging around. In comparison to petroleum, typically we're looking at plankton, zooplankton, and the ability of that stuff to collect is slightly different, at least as far as what we have found so far. Nice thing, again, is it's really accessible. We happen to have a lot of it here in the United States. Okay, so we're talking about, well, how much oil is actually out there? Well, one place that happens to have a lot of oil is Canada. Way up in Alberta, Canada, they have this location which has all this what we call tar sands, and it's somewhere near the surface. The problem is the refining of that product. It's a mess. Unlike putting a large straw, conventional, hole in the ground to pull up this oil, this is quite a bit different because we have to literally just dig it out of the ground, a very, very large area, and it has a huge environmental impact, let alone the amount of money that it costs to process it. Yes, there's energy out there and there's a lot of oil out there, but the cost based on money and environmentally is quite a bit more. So this is kind of that idea, is you have this stone, which is very porous, I guess you would say, but it's very tight. So it holds this oil product here, kerogen, and just to get a comparison as far as how much oil you can get out of a ton, there you have it. Okay, another resource that we have floating around, typically found in the crude oil excavation, is natural gas, because it's a lighter material. It's usually found towards the top. You saw this in a picture early on. And we used to just bypass that and just let it gas off because it wasn't what the drillers were looking for. They wanted that out of the way so they could get to the crude oil down below. But of course we now realize that it is a valuable resource and it's going to probably be used much more so in comparison to crude oil. Something else interesting, I'm not sure how valuable it is comparatively, but we can actually get this out of landfills. It's one of the quick release products out of the composing of a landfill. Looking at who has it, we notice there that Russia and Iran have a great deal amount of this. It's fairly clean burning in comparison to crude oil, but it's still a hydrocarbon, so it's putting CO2 into the atmosphere, and that has an effect. What this also is mentioning here is the CH4, the natural gas, which is primarily what's methane, which is natural gas. It is itself a very potent greenhouse gas. So when you are excavating for natural gas, when it gets into the environment, it is a much more effective greenhouse gas in comparison to carbon dioxide. All right, that's a good place to stop. We'll pick up on the third lecture here in just after this one.